Borodar, everybody. I can see that we've got some participants joining. Welcome, Croeso, to our webinar this morning on managing bias in artificial intelligence. We're just going to give it a couple of minutes whilst we get more attendees joining. We've been quite popular. We've got quite a few signups. We've got quite a few people who have completed a Menti, I believe, beforehand as well. So we'll be looking at that very shortly, but we want to just make sure that we give people an opportunity to join. Lots of new names in the participant list. Again, good morning, Borodar, everybody. Please feel free to jump in the chat, introduce yourselves, say hello, say good morning. We always like to hear where you're coming from, who's joining, who's interested. Just going to give it a couple of minutes to let more people join. Yeah, don't worry about it, James. I think we've muted everybody and other people can't join video either. So one not to worry about. If you're walking the dog, if you're watching along from somewhere else. Ah, Borodar, Lucy. I'm from not far from Edge Hill originally. I won't say where. I can see we've got Ayla in the chat as well. Thank you very much. So any questions that you ask will get picked up, even if you are on mute. We're up to 74 attendees now. So I think, given that it's 32 minutes past, I'm going to introduce everybody properly. And we'll crack on with the webinar. So again, Croeso, Borodar, welcome. My name is Jack Rigby. I am the Head of Technology for the Centre for Digital Public Services. This is a webinar in a series that we're running at the minute in collaboration with other institutions and organisations who are a bit more knowledgeable than us, and we can bring their expertise to you and us, and we can all learn together. Today's session is on managing bias in artificial intelligence. This is a topic that's very close to my heart. When we talk about using AI safely and responsibly, one of the major issues that we're concerned about and we want to mitigate is bias and managing that risk. So it's something that we often talk about offhand as something that we need to be conscious of, but we don't always get the chance to go into the detail of what exactly that means and what we can do about it. So I'm very happy to welcome our colleagues from the Alan Turing Institute today. We have, one second, I'm going to get everybody's name right. I have Deborah Morgan, John Francis, and Yumna Hashim, all from the Alan Turing Institute, researchers from the Alan Turing Institute's public policy team. And I'm going to be handing over to them in a minute. But first, Elise, I think we've got some Menti slides. Here we go. I'm not sure if everybody recognizes these, but we sent some slides out already, some questions, just to gauge where people's interest and knowledge was with this subject. As we can see, we're addressing a bit of a question that people have, not a great level of understanding or a bit of uncertainty, and this is totally good. I really appreciate everybody being open and honest here. I think it's the start of a really good conversation to have. It's not a good place to be where we assume that we know everything about AI and algorithmic systems and managing that bias, and hopefully that's what this session will be able to do for you here today. Again, I think we had a second question, Elise. Here we go. Engaging with guidance or training around bias in AI and algorithmic systems. So this is what we're really trying to address today. So without further ado, Elise, I think we're going to pass over to our colleagues at the Turing Institute. Thank you, Yumna. That's coming loud and clear. There we go. So thank you very much, and I'll pass over to you.
Okay, Borodar, everyone. It's really great to be here. So we are a group of researchers based at the Alan Turing Institute within the Public Policy Programme. So to begin with, just a quick round of introductions. My name is Deborah, and I'm a researcher in the public policy programme, but we're all within the AI for Public Services team. So I'll pass on to my colleague, John.
Hello, everyone. I'm John. I am a researcher here on the AI for Public Services team and excited to talk and meet with you all today.
Borda, everyone. I'm Yomna, and I'm very excited to be here today. I'm also a researcher in the AI for Public Services team with Deb and John, and I also work alongside the Ethics and Responsible Innovation team, also in the Public Policy Program. I'm really excited to get started with this presentation.
Okay, great, thanks. Well, I'll get started. Yeah, thank you also. It's really interesting to see the survey results. I think it's interesting that understanding was relatively low about this topic area, which, as already has been said, really supports our purpose and intention in this talk. So our aim in this talk really is we'll talk a little bit about AI in public services, and then we'll provide an overview of how bias can be defined and conceptualized in relation to AI and algorithmic systems, with a particular focus on their use in the public sector. We will then move to discuss technical measures and approaches to identify and mitigate bias, and then we'll conclude with a discussion about ethical considerations, signpost guidance and support that hopefully will be useful for you. We do want to stress at the outset that our aim is to provide an overview of some considerations and dimensions of this subject. However, research into both the forms of bias, impacts, technical and various ethical assurance mechanisms is happening right now. It's a very active field, which I think is a really good thing because it shows that there's lots of responsible work being done. But it does mean that there may be aspects of what we talk about or areas that we don't explore. As I say, our intention is to provide an overview. And hopefully the resources and ideas that we can signpost and assist you with further will be of interest and use to you. So to introduce us briefly, as lots of you may know already, the Alan Turing Institute, we're headquartered, and we are here now in the British Library. And we were created as the National Institute for Data Science in 2015, and in 2017 added AI to our remit. Unsurprisingly, the Institute is named in honour of Alan Turing, whose work in theoretical applied mathematics, engineering and computing are considered to be the key disciplines comprising data science and AI field. And our team sits within, as we've already said, the public policy team at the Turing, alongside other teams such as the AI ethics team and AI regulatory teams. And our aim in our team is to improve public services and outcomes for citizens through the responsible and effective adoption of AI in public services. We've got some examples on the slide of our work. You can see there's quite a breadth in terms of theoretical kind of frameworks and then also practical projects as well. We do believe that AI used responsibly can really support and improve the provision and delivery of public services, and our work is in pursuit of that aim. Okay, so moving on then, if we think about AI, I could spend the rest of this talk, because I'm sure you're probably aware, just defining what AI is, and there's lots of subdomains within the field, and a lot of debate really amongst various practitioners regarding what an accurate definition is. But the definition that's on the slide is one that I quite like, as I think it really foregrounds, as does the visual actually, the human component of AI. As lots of you will be aware, machine learning is a dominant form of AI, and is where the behavior of technology is learned and not explicitly programmed. And as we're very all aware, more recent developments in generative AI refer to deep learning models that can generate images and text and increasingly other content based on data that they're trained on. So we tend to think of, in our team, three kind of main deployment areas in relation to public services. And if you saw the head of our team, Dr. Jonathan Bright, his previous talk, he talked about these in more detail. But those three kind of deployment areas are perception, prediction, and generation. So thinking about those in a bit more detail, we've got some examples on the slide of different use cases in each of those categories. So perception being kind of understanding or interpreting a situation. So examples are often computer vision type applications. Prediction deployment areas, these are often areas, things like risk assessments, where a system is being used to support analysis, forecasting, or ranking of different solutions. And then generative systems, where again, as I've already discussed, these are really kind of generating new content and supporting decision making. through helping kind of summarizing maybe conversations, notes, administrative type functions, or increasing chatbot functionality. And really, when we think about bias can be prevalent in all of these three types of deployment areas. And the key issue, as we're going to talk about the rest of this talk, with bias in an AI or algorithmic system, is that a system in use can be scaled, and so may risk embedding and then scaling bias when used within human systems, especially in the context of decision making. So to use those three deployment area examples, when we think about perception systems, there has been prior research that has shown that in the facial recognition systems haven't recognized different skin tones as well as others when they're scanning, for example, passport photos, and you can see the challenges of that and the representation issues that presents. When we're thinking about prediction systems, maybe being used to rank people or produce kind of assessments of maybe candidates for jobs, there have been evidence of hiring algorithms that have been trained on data predominantly from one gender, and then preferring that gender, unsurprisingly, because that's been the dominant data they've been trained on when they're ranking applications. And then in newer generative systems, because they're often trained on huge corpuses of written or visual images, then they absorb the biases and the stereotypes that may be contained within those. Okay, so if we move on a little bit further to thinking about how we define bias. So understanding the risks of bias is really one dimension of trustworthy and responsible AI. Bias may not be, and I think this is really important to stress, not be introduced purposefully, but it can enter the AI lifecycle at many stages, inadvertently, in a variety of forms. And it also can emerge actually when systems are in use. Lots of us might be familiar with the idea of kind of automation bias, where people refer to systems. But at its core, bias can be conceived as I put on the slide, the risk that systems that work for some people may not work for all people, or may not work in the same way for all people or groups. Use cases are often highly contextualized. Use cases for AI in public services are often highly contextualized, as are the risks and considerations. And as I said, this is a kind of overview of those things. And as John and Yumna will dig into deeper, bias can be found or introduced at any stage of the development and importantly, the deployment lifecycle. And then kind of thinking about why this is really important is, as this quote from the Center for Data Ethics and Innovation outlines, successful and sustainable innovation in public services, I would add, is dependent on building and maintaining public trust in the use of systems and addressing bias and using systems responsibly is a key part of that. And as I said, bias is one component of fairness in decision making, alongside, as I'm sure lots of you who work in public services are aware, equality implications, respect for individual circumstances, and personal agency, and then reasonableness of decisions. As I think you've already had a previous talk, public sector bodies also need to be really alert to considerations around the public sector equality duty and how this intersects with the use of AI systems as well. So kind of in summary for this point, anticipating and considering the potential risks of embedding or scaling bias is really important when planning, procuring, and developing an AI system. So then to move on to think about the impacts of bias. So bias can create harms in accessing services or engaging with public bodies when introduced from any source. As already outlined, the kind of challenge of AI systems may be that their great potential utility in supporting delivery of services may mean that, particularly in the context of decision making, there is a risk that any bias that's present in data could become embedded. And that bias can not just come from data sources, it can come from assumptions that are made during development or assumption bias implications during kind of early stage testing, what's chosen to test, what's chosen to assess. And without appropriate consideration or monitoring, it can prevent various forms of risk and significant impacts. And as you can see on this slide here, in certain circumstances, AI can have a significant impact on people's lives. And some of those examples that are given there are actually from the recent UK policy paper, which talks about kind of examples, things like insurance offers, kind of, as you can see, the bias might be embedded within training data sets that's used, may affect the representation of people who are offered particular deals or particular services. I've also put down on there as well, the governance of artificial intelligence was looked at by the House of Commons Science, Innovation, Technology Committee, and in their work, they highlighted benefits that AI can bring, but they also highlighted challenges that the governance of AI must meet. And one of these challenges was the bias challenge. And within that, they reported some of the evidence they received. And on that quote, you can see some of the examples of bias that they explored. So this really highlights the risks of issues such as of recognition disparities, stereotype perceptions around gender, and then the way that then you can see how in systems in use, when you have these stereotypes and misrepresentations or a low representation in the data, that really then impacts, has real world impacts in systems in use. And then as you can see with the example they give of racial bias in insurance pricing, which I've mentioned before, really kind of has significant implications for what results are presented to people. Okay, so to conclude my section, thinking then, so we've kind of talked about definitions of bias, the potential impacts it can have, which there are potentially too many really for me to kind of go through all of them in the time. But there are a number of developing assurance mechanisms, technical standards, support, guidance, frameworks that are available when thinking about bias and fairness of AI systems in use. Lots of examples include guidance available at the Alan Turing Institute, as we'll discuss later. There's sorts of training programs that are available looking at both technical aspects and other aspects of thinking about addressing bias. As you've already been spoken about before, the Equality and Human Rights Commission has also got guidance on their website, as have a number of other regulators, notably the Information Commissioner's Office as well. So there is a lot of guidance out there. But as I said, use cases are often really highly contextualized, and issues around forms of bias may necessarily differ within different sectors and contexts. So as Yumna will move on to talk about some of the work that the AI ethics team are doing and continue to do to support deployment and support responsible deployment. I put on the slide as well a link to, we also host the AI Standards Hub, and there, if you go into the AI Standards Hub on the Alan Turing website and search bias, you'll see links to the developing technical standards around this issue as well, which are really useful to look at. And also, I just and the Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation actually have a current challenge where they're looking at offering bodies support to develop new solutions to address bias and discrimination. So I probably talked far too long, but I will now move on to John, who's going to talk a little bit further about kind of technical measures and approaches for bias mitigation.
Thank you, Deb and Boreda. Good morning, everyone. So when I'm thinking about how to identify bias, there are three common areas bias can derive from. So systemic biases, these result from procedures and practices of institutions that can result in certain social groups being advantaged. And these come about simply by how the existing rules and norms have been established. Human biases, on the other hand, reflect systematic errors in human thinking, and they're often related to how we perceive information. And these are sort of fundamental part of the human mind, and certainly not unique to human interactions with AI. For this talk, though, I'm going to focus on statistical and computational biases, which are present in the data sets and algorithmic processes used in the development of AI applications. So these biases arise from methodological constraints and practices as opposed to random error. And they often occur in the absence of any prejudice, partiality, or discriminatory intent. And this statistical bias can arise from all parts of the AI lifecycle. So in the data, we're thinking about who is represented, when is the data from, how is the data measured, in the algorithm, what choices were made by the AI engineer in terms of structure and benchmarking to ensure optimal outcomes. And in the usage, bias can also arise in how models are deployed to real-world conditions aligned with the computer lab. So next I'm going to talk through some of the types of statistical bias. And this is just one way of categorizing bias. I'm following the work here of Suresh and Gutag. There's lots of work in this area, and you can kind of make these delineations in a number of different ways. So looking at historical bias, these are pre-existing biases ingrained in the data. So the example I have here, there is a 2015 BBC article looking at Google image search for the word CEO. In 2015, about, I think, only 5% of Fortune 500 companies had CEOs of women. So this led to unintentional search results from Google where the only images that were presented were of men. Looking at representational and temporal biases, this is when the target population is not represented by the model's training data. ImageNet is a common large-scale data source for computer vision models. And about 45% of the data of the images come from the US and only 1% from China. So models using this data may have much less capacity to identify features common to Chinese images. The last type of data bias I'm going to talk about is measurement bias. If, for example, you were to use someone's degree classification as a proxy for a potential new employee's ability, this will likely have some bearing on how well they may perform at their job, but it's an imperfect and therefore biased measure of how successful they may be. Moving on to biases in the algorithm itself, aggregation bias can occur when a one-size-fits-all approach does not represent the data. So looking at this top right image, the orange and blue dots have different trajectories. They really can't be modeled by a singular function. So one of the groups will always be mispredicted when a singular function is used. Next, we have learning biases. These are where actual modeling choices can lead to performance disparities. For example, many model creators these days are prioritizing smaller, more compact models they can fit on mobile devices. And this can actually, at times, amplify performance disparities on data with underrepresented attributes. This happens because given a reduced capacity and size, an otherwise good model may learn to preserve information about only the most frequent features, potentially deprioritizing the information it learned about underrepresented groups. Evaluation bias, on the other hand, is when your benchmarks to evaluate a model may not accurately represent or measure the population. In a situation where you're trying to identify some very rarely occurring illegal transactions, a model that says all transactions are fine may be evaluated to have 99.99% accuracy, but that's only because it's not properly evaluating the data and weighting the accurate prediction of the rare cases much higher. The final type of bias I'll cover here is in the deployment phase. This is when there's a mismatch between the model's solution and usage in the real world. For example, in criminal justice, there are models intended to predict a person's likelihood of committing a future crime. These can be strong, unbiased, highly accurate models. However, if in practice, these tools are used instead to help determine the length of a prison sentence, there can be harmful consequences, such as justifying increased incarceration terms and unjustly penalizing people for crimes they haven't committed. So next, I want to talk about how we can measure bias. The detrimental effects of bias are often measured through some definition of fairness, which is very project and use case dependent and can vary depending on your goals or responsibilities. There are many different toolkits out there to measure fairness. So looking at the bottom of the slide, there are a few resources. Equitas from the University of Chicago has a decision tree which can help users audit their data or their tasks to choose the correct fairness measures. FairLearn came out of Microsoft, but has since grown into an open source community-driven toolkit to improve AI systems. And AI Fairness 360 from IBM has over 70 metrics of fairness. So there's quite a few options out there. Now, I don't want to spend too long going through all the many possible ways to measure bias, but I'll use a simple example of hiring potential candidates to go through a few of these. So looking at equalized odds, this is a strict, often difficult to implement measure, whereby the probability of a qualified applicant being hired and the probability of an unqualified applicant not being hired should be the same across all protected attributes. They should have the same rates for the same outcomes. But looking at equal opportunity, this is a bit less strict. So for hiring, qualified candidates should have the same hiring rates across attributes, but this may not be the case for unqualified candidates. Looking at demographic parity, this insists that the likelihood of a person being hired should be the same regardless of whether the person is in a protected group. For example, the same number of men and women are hired for a set of open positions. However, this could lead to a situation that is fair at the group level, but is unfair at the individual level, whereby maybe a more qualified candidate isn't hired to maintain the parity across demographics. Counterfactual fairness, on the other hand, means that a decision is fair towards an individual if they would be hired in the actual world and in a counterfactual world where they belong to a different demographic group. Lastly, conditional statistical parity requires people in both protected and unprotected groups to have equal probability of getting hired, but allows for conditions along some legitimate factors such as, maybe work experience, education, etc. So mitigating bias is difficult, but what are some ways when we find bias, that it can be mitigated or reduced? So at different parts of the AI life cycle, we can do some interventions. So in the pre-processing phase, when you're just looking at the data, you can adapt the input data to reduce or remove unwanted biases. An example of this is reweighing, where you apply weights to members of different groups to achieve a level of statistical parity. When you're looking at the algorithmic stage, you can modify the actual training of the model itself to be less biased. So an example of this is adversarial debiasing. In this situation, you would simultaneously predict some outcome and individuals' membership in a protected group. So on one side, you're maximizing accuracy, while you're also minimizing the ability of an algorithm to predict group membership. In the post-processing, after the model's been developed and the predictions have been made, you can adjust these final predictions to account for biases, and there are various methods to do this. But these are just a few of the tools available to help mitigate bias. There are, of course, benefits and trade-offs to all these methods, and many more examples exist. This is a very lively field of research currently. So my last slide here, I want to just take a second to touch on generative AI. So this has stormed on the scene in the past couple of years. We've got text generators like ChatGPT and Bard, image generators like DALL-E, Midjourney, and a lot of the data issues, historical, representational, and measurement biases remain. For example, not all languages have equal representation on the internet. And evaluation remains a thorny issue. For example, if you're looking at image generators, it's easy to quantify how often certain skin tones or genders appear in the outputs. But there are other details that are more difficult to measure, like religious iconography, types of facial hair. These factors may still be contributing to the overall bias encoded in the outputs, but they're hard to pin down. So looking at some of the newer ways bias occurs and is complicated by generative AI. What's in the training data? Companies training large models don't always even know what's contained within their data, making it difficult to do pre-processing steps. Generated content may find its way into the training of future models, further complicating how biases are embedded within AI. And chatbots can amplify certain linguistic patterns and styles, perhaps to the detriment of other less formal modes of speech. Chatbots can also play much heavier into confirmation biases, selectively generating content that reinforces individual viewpoints. And somewhat dangerously, but also helpfully, the outputs of the models look hyper-realistic. This increases their usability, but it can also lull us into blindly trusting the outputs without continuing to critically evaluate this tool for bias during deployment. I'll now pass things over to Yumna.
Thanks, John. Yeah, so now that we kind of have an understanding of what bias is in the context of AI systems and some of the ways that it manifests, and the different technical guardrails that we can implement to help mitigate them, it's important that we discuss how these systems are embedded within wider social structures and how a deliberative approach to the design and development of these technologies can help inform more just, ethical, and equitable outcomes. So I will start. I apologize because I'm also controlling the screen. Okay, so what do we mean when we say AI ethics? AI ethics refers to an ever-evolving set of values, principles, and governance techniques that aim to guide the responsible design, development, and deployment of AI technologies and to mitigate the harms as they arise. And the field emerged essentially in direct response to the growing risks that are associated with the development and widespread deployment of these technologies, of which bias is just one of many risks. It's also, I know Deb mentioned this earlier, but it is worth noting that a lot of these risks and harms are inadvertent. So they're not necessarily the result of very deliberate choices on the developer side, or that they have malicious intent. But through actionable tools and governance mechanisms, the field essentially attempts to tackle the social and moral risks that will arise through the use of AI systems. Yeah, and in a nutshell, at its core, the field aims to center, safeguard, and promote the well-being of impacted communities that will be affected by these technologies. So AI ethics in the public sector. While of course an AI ethics approach is vital irrespective of where an AI technology is being implemented, considerations of AI ethics are especially important in the public sector, where government is primarily a duty bearer and has core responsibilities to the public, which include the protection of social goods, such as environmental protection, health, housing, community amenities, education, recreation, cultural, religion, and where government also acts as an equalizer for justice in the delivery of fundamental rights and freedoms. So we know that the application of AI-driven technologies in the public sector can have cascading and differential impacts on different groups within society, and given that the stakes are very high in the public sector. On the right-hand side, I've listed a few areas where we know AI is already in use in the public sector. So in health and social care, for example, we have systems that predict the development and spread of disease. In local government, we have systems that predict population trends and inform development plans. In education, we have systems that are automating evaluation to help streamline the work of teachers and educators. And in the criminal justice system, we have systems that are automating the analysis of digital evidence in courts to also help streamline the work that is done by those civil servants. When it comes to what are some of the frameworks and tools that are available to us to implement AI ethics in the public sector, the Ethics and Responsible Innovation team here at the Turing, together with a few other collaborators across the Institute, have worked on developing the UK's first official guidance on applying principles of AI ethics and safety in the public sector. And that I've plugged that in on the left by Dr. David Leslie, who's the director of the program. And so that was in very close collaboration with the Office for Artificial Intelligence and the Government Digital Service. In 2021, the UK's National AI Strategy came out, and it recommended the expansion of this guidance and resulted in the development of an AI ethics and governance and practice program, which I'll give a little bit more detail on in a bit. So there are various ways for us to conceptualize the AI project lifecycle, and John's already introduced the idea of the breakdown. I believe it was data and model, and I can't remember the third one, I'm sorry. But so there are various different ways of conceptualizing it, and they're each valid in their own context and for different use cases. So I'll be drawing on the work that was carried out by the Ethics and Responsible Innovation team, and specifically the socio-technical approach to the life cycle, which was developed by Chris Burr and David Leslie at the Institute. So this approach essentially breaks down the life cycle into three key stages, which are they're made to be generalizable intentionally and practice centered, so that they can map out well onto different use cases. And so it's design, development, and deployment. An understanding of the technical stages of the AI lifecycle is, of course, an incredibly important step, but equally important is an awareness and understanding that these technical processes don't operate in a void. They're embedded in social practices and processes, which are themselves influenced by human values, interests, norms, and of course, institutions. And so by taking a socio-technical approach or view of AI projects, we can identify the very interwoven nature of technical and social aspects of the life cycles, and we can begin to identify the best mitigation strategies for, in this case, biases and other harms as and when they occur. So I've put up an example here. It's kind of building on an example that John had given of representation bias and how that can map onto the AI project lifecycle. So in this example, we have a system checking app that's been trained on data collected exclusively through smartphone use. And so the problem we have now is that a subgroup within that population is underrepresented in the data set. The impact that it will have is that there will be potential misdiagnosis of groups within the general population for those who lack access to connectivity or are just not online. And so a socio-technical approach to thinking through representation bias begins to map out these biases along the life cycle, identifying the impacted stakeholders and the potential outcomes that this risk might have. And then once we've identified these risks, we can start to look at mechanisms of redress. But what are some of these mechanisms that are available to us? So in the program, the AI ethics and governance program, which I will continue to say a bit more about in a few slides, we introduce a series of frameworks and principles which can help guide responsible research practices that ensure that risks are identified and mitigated at various stages throughout the AI project life cycles. And that includes, at the very top, you can see I've plugged this in, but you don't have to read everything that's on the slide. But these provide an opportunity essentially for project teams to engage in an ongoing process of sense checking and reflection on the social and ethical implications of their practices. The first one, the Care and Act framework, is intentionally reflective and less prescriptive in nature, and it's meant to act as a guide for project teams who are starting to think through how they can implement these notions of fairness and responsible innovation into their projects. Then we move on to the fast track principles, which stands for fairness, accountability, sustainability, and transparency. And those provide slightly more actionable tools that can help project teams to ensure that they're safeguarding public trust and delivering safe and reliable AI innovation. And all of these taken in sum we refer to them as the process-based governance framework. And that is at kind of the most concrete level and really helps project teams with very actionable tools that they can take for the documentation and mitigation of risks as they arise. So in the program, we also provide a number of mechanisms and tools. So I'm not going to go into each of them, but they're available to project teams and it enables them essentially to meaningfully engage with ethical frameworks and principles that are intended to help mitigate the risks. So if you're interested in learning more about these tools, then I would really suggest that you take a look at the public sector workbooks, which I'll link you to in the next slides. They're a tremendous resource and they have a great deal of really invaluable information. So I'll just read through some of these. So stakeholder impact and engagement assessments essentially help project teams to identify who are the stakeholders, what are some of the mechanisms that we can implement to engage with these stakeholders, and what are some of the very direct impacts that might happen to specific stakeholders based on their characteristics. And yeah, so here I've just put up a snapshot of the process-based governance framework. It's intended to be, it's the last stage of that kind of multi-tiered framework that I presented earlier. And it's meant to be an end-to-end accountability framework, which integrates all of the principles that are introduced, including sustainability, safety, accountability, fairness, and transparency, and outlines the necessary activities and considerations across the life cycle, which are required for operationalizing some of the values and principles. And this is just an example, but you can see the life cycle is broken down into the 3 stages, and there's shading between the stages just to showcase that they kind of bleed into each other. There isn't clear delineations between each of these stages in the life cycle. And we can see the different governance mechanisms and actions that can be taken at different stages to help mitigate the risks depending on where they arise within the life cycle. And yeah, so here is a brief introduction to the AI and ethics and governance program. So it's essentially a series of modules that are providing resources for the practical implementation of the official guidance, which has been developed by the UK government and the Alan Turing Institute. We have launched 4 out of the 8 workbooks that you can see on the screen. And each of the workbooks covers how to implement a key component of the frameworks that I mentioned prior. And that includes, you can see there's sustainability in practice, fairness in practice, responsible data stewardship, safety, and transparency. So each of the workbooks focuses on a specific domain, just so that the case studies that are presented can be illustrative and can promote ethical reflection in a slightly more grounded way. But that's not to say that if you're coming from a different domain that you won't benefit from taking a look at these workbooks. They are primarily aimed at individuals and organizations in the public sector, but anyone who's interested in learning about AI ethics can absolutely make use of these workbooks. Each of them has been designed so that they can stand alone as a standalone guide, and they're open source to promote kind of reflective thinking, and they provide a lot of really helpful exercises to help thinking through some of the key concepts that are presented in the workbooks. So here, if you scan the QR code, it will take you to the project page on the Turing's website. And just to say, so I mentioned we've launched the first few of these, the first 4 of those workbooks, and we're currently in the process of piloting the remaining 4 workbooks. So if you are working in a public sector agency or you're a public sector organization and you're interested in taking part in the piloting of these programs, please do reach out to us, and you'll find all the necessary contact information if you scan that QR code. And as I wrap up, I also just wanted to plug in a few examples of other resources and guidelines that are available to the public sector, including Project Explain, which was carried out by the Information Commissioner's Office alongside the Alan Turing Institute. And that also provides a ton of really invaluable resources and information. You have the Data Ethics Framework by the CDDO, and of course, the Algorithmic Transparency Reporting Standard Hub, which is a joint collaboration between CDDO and CDEI. And there's also an AI checklist for public bodies in England. These are just a few examples, so it's not comprehensive by any means. But we've also plugged in a few further resources that might not themselves necessarily be frameworks, but are also great starting points if you are looking to learn a little bit more about bias and how you can mitigate bias specifically in the context of the public sector. And yeah, I will stop here.
Thank you very much. Wow, a lot of information there, a lot to take in, especially around the different organizations and the different tools and resources that are out there for us to look through. We do have a few minutes, so if there are any burning questions that anybody has, and they want to share in the chat, any initial thoughts or feelings that they want to get, we do have a couple of minutes. But if there is anything that comes up later, if you reflect on this and you have anything more you want to ask, of course, as ever, get in touch with anybody at CDPS, get in touch with myself or the folks at the Turing Institute. We can point you in the direction to have a further conversation about. This is an ongoing conversation. I think from what I saw in the chat at the start, people, and from the mentee as well, that people are in a really open-minded, a good frame of mind with this. We know that this is a new thing to be thinking about. We know that we don't know everything yet, and that's what I'd really encourage people to think about. It's something that come across in all of our presenters today, that an open-mindedness to learning more, listening to people, making sure that we are being transparent and working towards mitigating bias in that way, using the tools that have been presented today. I don't see any initial questions coming in. That's not a problem. Like I said, if we reflect on anything and have any more questions, get in touch with us. Elise, here we go. This is what we're expecting. We do have a Menti. If anybody wants to scan or use the code, if you go to menti.com and enter the code, I've got a few more messages to give out today. By all means, listen and fill in the Menti at the same time. These are going to be questions representative of the questions that we asked before the session, so we can see how the session went, how it met your expectations, what we could improve on. We're a learning organization here at CDPS. Everything that we do, we're looking to improve and iterate on. So this is how we get that feedback. This is how we make these sessions more important, more relevant to you, more useful. So your feedback is always greatly appreciated. It really helps us. So I'll leave that on for a couple more seconds. There we go. Scan that with your smartphone or jot that down as a code, and we will be able to get all of that lovely feedback. Thank you very much. So in addition to the workbooks that were mentioned and the other links that the folks at the Turing Institute have mentioned that we'll be sending out, we have a couple of plugs for ourselves. If you found today useful, we also have a show and tell coming up next week. We've been currently undertaking a bit of a discovery project across the public sector in Wales to ask how automation and AI is being used in the public sector. We've had a lot of interesting responses. We've had a lot of interviews that have been taken out. Previous webinars have had questionnaires that have been sent out. We are now in a position to share some of our preliminary understandings. A bit of analysis has been done already. So if you'd like to hear more about that, it's only half an hour next week, 1:30 till 2:30. Bring a sandwich along and listen to what we've been doing. And if you haven't heard from us already, our book on trio writing came out this summer. This is a new approach to writing bilingual content. It's a very popular, very useful approach to making sure that all of your content is available in both English and Welsh. It's a good read. It's available to download now, and it's getting a lot of good feedback to make sure that all of your content is bilingual. So it's a bit of a collaborative approach to designing bilingual content. I think that is everything that we needed to cover. So I'd just like to remind everybody that this is part of a series. The recording is going to be available on YouTube along with the other webinars that we've already done. So if you've not been able to make all of it, you've missed the start of the session, or you think that your colleagues would appreciate watching this back, or if you want to see any of our other webinar sessions, all the way back from what is AI into procurement. We've had a session with the on the public sector equality duty that was mentioned here today. All of these good resources are there to take in, watch them back, make more notes. And again, the door is always open here for questions. So get in touch with me or anybody else at CDPS. I've seen a lot of new names in the chat and a lot on the participant list. I'd like to point you towards our website. Sign up. We have more webinars. We have communities of interest, communities of practice, lots of resources and tools that everybody can get hold of. And we'll like to encourage you along to more sessions like this. So without further ado, I'd just like to thank everybody for showing. And again, thanks to our colleagues at the Turing Institute. And we'd like to see you again at another session soon, hopefully. Thank you very much.